Well, Europe will never be a neutral mediator between Ukraine and Russia. That's the message from the EU's foreign policy chief, Kallas, who went on to say that the EU is on Ukraine's side. She made the comments as EU foreign ministers gathered in Cyprus to debate their role in any future negotiations with Moscow. The talks come as Washington becomes increasingly detached from Ukraine and as the leadership in Kyiv calls on Europe to play a stronger role. Kallas says that Ukraine and Russia would have to negotiate a peace deal themselves, but with European support for Kyiv.
Who could be mediator? I think it is very important that we push Ukraine and Russia to talk to each other, because there are so many issues where only they can decide and nobody else. So we can, there can be countries that do this shuttle diplomacy, but in the end, it has to be them who sit down on these issues that only they can decide.
It is interesting what Europe is saying there and what it's not saying. Europe will play a role supporting Ukraine. Perhaps more important, the United States is not mentioned at all. Joining me now is Nathalie Tocci, who has worked as an advisor to EU foreign policy chiefs in the past. She is now the director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Nathalie, it's good to have you with us. I want to start with Europe and its relationship with the U.S. You co-authored a piece in Foreign Affairs recently. That article says that Europe is learning to move collectively and in cooperation with others when the United States acts erratically. So how has Europe's approach to Ukraine changed with reduced U.S. support? And how is Europe doing in its 101 course in strategic autonomy?
Well, when we talk about European strategic autonomy, normally it tends to be a fairly bleak conversation. However, I think when we actually talk about Ukraine, and increasingly when we talk about the transatlantic relationship, it's becoming an increasingly upbeat story. As far as Ukraine is concerned, despite the abandonment, in fact, the betrayal of the United States of Ukraine, there was indeed, a risk. Many worried that this would split Europe. Actually, what we've seen in the course of the last year and a half has been not only that unity on Ukraine remaining, but actually translating into increased financial and military support. And when it comes to the United States, although, of course, we spent perhaps a little bit too long flattering and trying to keep Trump on side, I think the minute in which leaders are increasingly realizing that there is no flattery which is going to do the trick, and they have started, particularly after the Greenland crisis, to actually make a mark and make sure that there is actually a hill that we're prepared to stand on, we actually realized that the world didn't fall on our heads. So I think, slowly, but perhaps surely, we are actually making our way towards greater autonomy.
And perhaps we see that with these EU foreign ministers who are now discussing potential future talks with Moscow. Let me ask you, what should Europe's role be in shaping these negotiations?
Well, firstly, let me say I actually don't think there will be any negotiations. I think that this is actually a fairly abstract conversation, given that there is no indication whatsoever that Russia is actually interested in talks. The day in which Russia will become interested in talks, I very much support the position that you're reporting, High Representative Kallas, as mentioning, i.e. the fact that this is not the Europeans being mediators between Russia and Ukraine. If anything, it's about Europeans negotiating with Russia together with Ukraine, given that indeed this is a war in many respects between Russia and Europe, or rather, I should say, a war that Russia is waging against Europe, which starts in Ukraine, but alas, doesn't actually end in Ukraine.
I understand that you were in Kyiv recently. You wrote about a grounded confidence in Kyiv right now, despite U.S. support dropping off and despite the fact that there is no sign to an end to this war. What is driving this confidence among Ukrainians, and how does it influence Europe's responsibilities?
Well, actually, in many respects, it's a confidence which is growing precisely because there has been a dwindling U.S. support. Many feared, starting with Ukrainians themselves, that the minute in which the U.S. indeed did abandon them, the line would fall and everything would collapse. And actually, it hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened essentially for two sets of reasons. I think primarily because, and this is where the confidence comes from in Ukraine, that Ukrainians are mainly increasingly reliant upon themselves. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of military capacities used by Ukrainians in the war are actually produced inside Ukraine. And then, of course, alongside this, there is the European support, which particularly after the ousting of Viktor Orban in Hungary has become, let us say, a little bit more certain and certainly a little bit more rapid than what it used to be when up until when he was in power.
You know, there's a lot of talk right now, names as potential envoys for Europe who could perhaps be part of the mediation between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, we've heard names such as the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the former ECB head Mario Draghi, or the former Finnish President Niinistö. I want you to take a listen to what Kallas said today about all of this name dropping.
Now, I find that it's a trap that Russia wants us to walk into, that we discuss who talks to them, and they are already picking who is suitable or who is not. Let's not walk into that trap. Negotiations is always a team effort. You have good cops, you have bad cops, you have a strategy, how you go to the table. So that's why the substance is much more important than who.
Yeah, substance more important than who. I mean, Kallas, she wants us to stop speculating and she wants us to concentrate on demands and strategy. But what does that speculation reveal about Europe's leverage and credibility? I mean, we need someone to do the corralling, don't we?
Yes, we do. I mean, I think tragically what it reveals is that presumably who should be the automatic names that come to mind are the leaders of EU institutions. So whether this is the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, whether it's President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, or indeed whether it's Kallas, these should be the automatic names. So I think, regardless of, and I agree with, Kaya when she was, when she's saying basically this is a trap. But I think aside from the trap, the reason why we Europeans are actually risking to fall in it also has to do with the fact that we ourselves, and this is a massive mistake, risk in this way undermining our own institutions.
How so?
Well, because as I said, the automatic name should be, we shouldn't be speculating about someone else, right? I mean, the EU leaders are already there, and those which in different capacities have a foreign policy competence. So why on earth should we be thinking about someone else, right? So in this sense, I think, not only is it abstract because there are no negotiations in the making, not only is it irrelevant because indeed we should be talking about substance more than form, but it risks delegitimizing our own European institutions.
So how do you see Europe balancing putting pressure on Moscow, at the same time keeping a door open for potential negotiations?
I mean, this has always been, in a sense, the approach. I mean, I think, diplomacy and coercive instruments in different shapes and forms, starting, of course, with sanctions when it comes to the European Union, are and have always been two sides of the same coin, right? I persuade you into accepting a particular position because in my hands I have a carrot and I have a stick. But if, the stick is not there, particularly when it comes to Moscow, the talk is, frankly speaking, fairly empty talk, right? So diplomacy and leverage are really two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm. And, with U.S. military support greatly reduced, how should Europe recalibrate its, defense, economic, diplomatic strategies to ensure Ukraine's survival?
Well, essentially by doing more of what it's already doing, right? I mean, I think, militarily, as I said, we are in a situation which is actually the most positive situation that Ukraine has been in as far as the war is concerned, at least for the last year and a half. And as I said, this has happened despite, or perhaps because of the US's abandonment of Ukraine. So I think militarily it's about enabling Ukraine to do more of what it's doing, particularly as far as the development of its drone industry is concerned. When it comes to sanctions, aside from adopting package after package after package, where the real bulk of the work really should take place really revolves around ensuring that the sanctions that we have approved are actually implemented. And on that front, I think we could be doing a hell of a lot better.
And Nathalie, let me just ask you before we run out of time. You write that Donald Trump, ironically, may have done what summits, white papers, and decades of diplomacy could not: fuse Europe together. But how can you be so sure that in a post-Trump America, a post-Trump world, that Europe will not want to find shelter yet again under that American security umbrella?
I think I would boil it down to one little word, and that word is trust. When trust is broken, it's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. And this is really the first time that trust across the Atlantic has been broken in such a dramatic way. There have been many moments of transatlantic disagreement, divergence over policy questions, but it's the first time that we basically have an administration in Washington in different ways threatening European countries. And once that threat is made, once that trust is broken, I really struggle to imagine that we're simply going to go back to the past, because that past is no longer available, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it sounds like cheating in a marriage, if you will. Nathalie Tocci.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good to have you with us. Always good to get your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rosie Birchard is in Limassol, Cyprus. She joins us now. Rosie, are EU foreign ministers speaking with one voice when it comes to Ukraine and Russia?
You know, broadly on the surface, they are definitely speaking with one voice on Russia. So here are some of the things they agree on. They say they must have a real seat at the table when it comes to any sort of eventual peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. And they're agreed on what cards they have to play there. We know that Russia, in the event of peace, will want sanctions relief. The EU has issued a slew of sanctions against Russia over the years, and it's also enshrined some of them into longer-term laws, the likes of bans on imports of Russian oil. And on the other hand, it also has some other cards to play. Think about Ukraine's aspirations for joining the EU. That might also play into an eventual peace deal down the line. But I think it's about talking to Russia. There's the real areas of disagreement and difficulties that lie ahead, because really that is the big question that they're grappling with. They want a seat at the table. They say it's absolutely necessary, that no peace deal can be struck without them. But how to get to that table, who to send to that table, those questions are still really wide open. And that's something EU foreign ministers have been trying to kind of put their heads together and work out. Why? Because they think it's absolutely necessary, but also because Kyiv is concretely asking it of them. We know the US is backing away here. It's saying it doesn't have the capacity, the time. It no longer wants to take a leading role when it comes to peace negotiations or talks toward that between Russia and Ukraine. Kyiv says the European Union should play a bigger role diplomatically. What that role should look like, that's what still needs really to be spelled out.
And we know who Russia wants the EU to send to the table. They have proposed former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder as mediator. We heard a little bit about how that has been received on the EU level. Fill us in with the backstory here, Rosie.
Yeah, so we have had talks for weeks, months, and even years, really, on who the EU could have as a kind of Russia whisperer. Who might be someone that could be an envoy, that could represent the European Union's interests at some future talks toward a peace deal. So the Russian president put forward his own idea, a former German chancellor, and that idea really went down here with EU ministers as a lead balloon, really, because that former German chancellor is really seen as someone who is incredibly Russia-friendly, ex-chancellor Schröder. And Kallas, who's the EU's top diplomat, even said at the time that of course Putin would propose him, because it would be like Russia being sat at both sides of the table. Now, there are all sorts of other names which would be much more palatable to European ministers that have been floating around, especially for the last couple of days and weeks. Some of them are another ex-German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, though she's kind of ruled herself out. We've also heard of talk of the Finnish President, Alexander Stubb, as a potential envoy. We've heard of talks of Mario Draghi, the ex-Prime Minister of Italy, and Jean-Claude Juncker, who used to head up the European Commission. So there are all sorts of names out there. But there's also a really big concern that talking about who should go is a major distraction from the real issue here, because as the EU is mulling diplomacy with Russia, well, let's not forget that Moscow is intensifying strikes on Ukraine, and it has also, in the last few days, threatened concretely to kill EU diplomats based in Kyiv. And Kallas, who's the EU's top diplomat, really spelled it out today. She said, this talk of Russia seeming to say it's open to diplomacy, well, that really is nothing more than a trap. That's her point of view. On the other hand, we heard from the likes of Belgium's foreign minister saying, look, this is a moment we need to seize. Because the US has backed away, Europe needs to step forward, and it needs to find someone who embodies the European perspective.
So, Rosie, then what can we expect concretely to come out of this particular meeting? For example, are we talking about a finalized list of conditions ready, for the EU to send to the Kremlin?
What's really interesting here is that it's those conditions that EU ministers say the focus should be on. They say it should not really be about the who goes at this stage, but what they go with, not the messenger, but the message. And the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, Kallas, was in a press conference, laid out what she thinks some of the EU's red lines should be. Some of them are a baseline I think that most EU countries would agree on, or all of them, which would be, for example, having a real ceasefire as the starting point for proper talks on a peace deal. Some of the others are more controversial. One of the ideas she floated is Russia's military being restricted in future. That's because Russia says Ukraine's military should be restricted, and Kallas, EU's top diplomat, says, well, if Russia wants it for Ukraine, then it should be willing to make those concessions itself. Her idea is that there's been really only concessions talked about on Ukraine's side so far, and there's been very little push toward actually asking Moscow what it's willing to give up, especially that was the accusation that was laid at the feet of the United States in its approach to trying to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. So I think that's something that Kallas is trying to corral EU ministers around, a clear set of conditions, a clear set of red lines. But I think there's still really disunity there. I mean, I asked her really concretely about this. I said, are these your proposals, or are these the EU's red lines? And she said, well, I didn't hear any objections to my idea, but that's a very different thing from all EU states signing on the dotted line and saying these are our conditions which we are going to go to peace talks with. And let's not forget, any idea of peace still, frankly, feels very far off, not least Ukrainian civilians that are living under bombardment and feel very clearly that there's no sense that Russia at the moment has any real desire for peace. That is absolutely how it's seen here among most of these EU ministers, at least.
TW's Rosie Birchard joining us from Cyprus. Thank you, Rosie.